The bottle hit the table, the laughter kept climbing, and one Marine went very, very still. Across the bar, a man in a wheelchair sat alone with a glass of water, his jacket patch worn thin from years of sun and rain. The young Marine did not know it yet, but he had just asked a question that would change the whole room. He had asked a stranger about his call sign. What happened in the next 10 minutes would leave grown men speechless, a bully on his knees, and a bar full of strangers standing at attention for a man they had ignored all night. Stay with this one. By the end, you will understand why some quiet men deserve a second look before you judge them. Let's go back to where it started, on an ordinary Friday night in a small town that did not know who it had been overlooking for the last 3 years. Daniel Cole woke up before sunrise, the way he had every day since he came home. He did not need an alarm clock anymore. His body had learned to wake with the dark, a habit built over years of watches and patrols. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at his right leg, the real one, and then at the metal and carbon fiber one leaning against the nightstand. He reached for it the same way another man might reach for his shoes. It took him 4 minutes to get ready for the day. It used to take him 30 seconds. He did not think about that anymore. He just moved forward the way he always had. His house sat at the edge of town, small and plain, with a single-car garage that he had turned into a workshop. Danny fixed motorcycles for a living now. He was good at it, the kind of good that came from patience and steady hands. Customers left their bikes with him and came back to find every bolt tightened, every wire clean, every problem solved without a single wasted word. He did not talk much, he never had. But people trusted him because his work told them everything they needed to know about the man doing it. By 7 in the morning, he had coffee brewing and the garage door open to let in the cool air. A red motorcycle sat on his lift waiting for a new chain. He worked slow and careful, the same way he used to move through tall grass on the other side of the world. Some habits never leave a man, they just find new work to do. Danny liked it that way. The quiet of the garage matched something quiet inside him, something that had taken years to find again. At noon, he ate a sandwich standing up because sitting still for too long made his back ache where old shrapnel scars still pulled at the skin. He did not complain. He had learned that complaining did not fix anything, and the men he used to serve with had lost far more than he had. He kept a photograph on his workbench, tucked behind a can of bolts, where customers would not see it unless they were looking. It showed 5 young men in desert gear, arms around each other, squinting into bright sunlight. Only 2 of those men were still alive. Danny was one of them. His afternoon customer was a nervous young man named Corporal Ray Fenton, home on leave from the United States Marine Corps for the first time in over a year. Ray had heard about Danny's shop from a cousin who swore the old mechanic worked miracles on old engines. Ray pulled up on a beat-up motorcycle that coughed black smoke every time it idled. He climbed off, still in his physical training shirt, still carrying himself with that straight-backed posture that boot camp never fully lets go of. He introduced himself the way young Marines do, polite but a little too eager, the way a person acts when they are still new enough to be proud of every rank and every patch. Danny looked the bike over without much comment, running a hand along the engine block, listening to small sounds most people would never notice. He told Ray it needed a new carburetor and maybe a week of work. Ray nodded, disappointed but not surprised. As he waited for Danny to write up an estimate, his eyes drifted around the garage, landing on old photographs pinned to a corkboard near the workbench. One photo caught his attention more than the others. It showed a sniper team dug into a hillside, faces covered in dust, eyes sharp even through the grain of an old camera. Ray asked in a careless, curious way if Danny had ever served. Danny said yes without elaborating, the way men do when a memory costs more to explain than it is worth. Ray, still young enough to chase details instead of reading a room, asked what unit, what job, what years. Danny answered each question in short, plain sentences, giving away only what was necessary. He did not offer his call sign, he never did. Some things a man keeps folded away, not because he is ashamed, but because saying them out loud invites questions he does not want to answer in a garage on a Tuesday afternoon. Danny walked Ray around the side of the shop to show him a stack of old parts he could use for a discount, since he never liked charging a young Marine full price. As they walk, Ray noticed a row of small dog tags hanging from a nail near the door, each one worn smooth from handling. He did not ask about them. Something in the quiet way Danny glanced at them told him this was not the moment. Ray simply nodded and let the silence sit, the way a good listener learns to do around men who have carried more than they show. The two of them talked a little longer about engines, about the town, about how strange it felt for Ray to be home after so long overseas. Danny asked careful questions, the kind that came from real curiosity rather than small talk, and Ray found himself opening up more than he expected to a stranger he had just met. There was something steady about Danny that made people want to talk, even though the man himself barely said a word. It was a rare kind of presence, built from years of learning to listen before speaking. Ray left an hour later with a promise to return once the parts arrived. He did not know yet that he would see this quiet mechanic again much sooner than expected, in a place neither of them chose, under circumstances that would strip away every polite boundary they had kept between them. For now, Danny closed the garage at 5 o'clock, locked the door, and drove his modified truck toward the one place in town where he still allowed himself to relax. A bar called the Anchor Post, run by a retired Navy chief who never charged veterans full price and never asked questions about the ones who came in quiet and left early. Danny liked it there. It was the one place he did not have to explain himself. That was about to change. If this story is pulling you in already, tap that like button now, because the next part gets a lot more interesting. The Anchor Post filled up fast on Friday nights, packed with locals who worked hard all week and wanted a place to unwind. Behind the bar, an American flag hung next to a Marine Corps flag and a Navy flag, each one a little faded from years of cigarette smoke and low light. Danny took his usual seat at the far end of the bar near the wall where he could see the whole room and nobody could sneak up behind him. It was not paranoia, it was training. A habit built from years of needing to know every exit before he trusted a room enough to relax in it. That night, a different group came in loud, taking over the pool table and two booths like they owned the place. Their leader was a man named Tyler Briggs, a car dealership manager with a wide smile and a voice built for selling things nobody needed. Tyler wore an expensive watch and talked with his hands, the kind of man who filled every silence with his own opinion. He had never served a day in his life, but he liked to wear a faded army green shirt he had bought at a surplus store, the kind of shirt that made him feel tough without costing him anything real. Behind Tyler came his usual crowd, men who laughed a beat too late at his jokes and agreed with everything he said. There was Marcus, a loud car salesman who worked under Tyler and copied his boss's mannerisms without noticing it. There was Deacon, a younger man who mostly stayed quiet but always positioned himself close to Tyler, soaking up whatever confidence spilled off him. They ordered too many drinks too fast, the kind of crowd that made a bartender start watching the clock, waiting for the trouble that always seemed to follow men like this once the night wore on. Tyler had grown up in this town, well known for chasing attention wherever he could find it. He had never held a job for more than a few years without moving on to something flashier, something with a bigger office and a louder title. People who knew him well described him as a man who needed a room to notice him, who felt uneasy in any silence he did not control. That need followed him into every bar, every dinner, every conversation, turning ordinary nights into small performances only he seemed to enjoy. Tyler noticed Danny almost immediately, the way a certain kind of man always notices anyone quiet in a loud room. He clocked the wheelchair Danny sometimes used on bad days, though tonight he stood at the bar using a simple cane instead, his prosthetic leg doing most of the work. Tyler leaned toward Marcus and made a comment loud enough for half the bar to hear, something about slow service and old men taking up space at a young crowd's bar. A few people chuckled out of habit, not because it was funny, but because loud confidence has a strange power to pull weaker laughter out of a room. Danny did not react. He had faced worse men in worse places, men whose words could not touch what he had already survived. He kept his eyes on his glass and let the noise pass over him like weather. But small comments have a way of building on each other, each one a tiny brick stacked on the last until a wall forms without anyone noticing it happening. Tyler kept glancing over, testing the silence, waiting to see if Danny would flinch. He did not, and somehow TH. It made Tyler want to push harder. A phone buzzed loudly on the bar, playing music instead of vibrating, because Tyler liked people to know when he was getting a call. He answered it without lowering his voice, talking about a car deal, using words like crushed it and destroyed the competition, laughing at his own jokes before anyone else could. The bartender, an older man named Walt who had served 20 years in the Navy before opening this place, shot Tyler a look that most regulars would have understood as a warning. Tyler either did not notice or did not care. Ray Fenton walked in around 8, dressed in civilian clothes now, meeting a few old high school friends for the first time since basic training. He spotted Danny at the far end of the bar and gave him a small nod, the kind two people share when they recognize each other but are not quite friends yet. Danny nodded back, then returned his attention to his drink. Ray settled in with his friends near the middle of the room, unaware that he had just placed himself directly between two forces about to collide. As the night went on, Tyler's group grew louder and their comments grew sharper. Marcus made a joke about slow old men blocking parking spots with special permits, glancing toward Danny's cane leaning against the bar. Deacon laughed too hard, the nervous laugh of someone trying to prove loyalty. Tyler smiled the whole time, enjoying the attention, enjoying the small thrill that comes from picking at someone who refuses to fight back. He did not know yet what kind of man he was circling. He only knew that so far, nothing had made this quiet stranger blink. Across the room, Walt kept glancing over every few minutes, torn between his instinct to step in and his respect for Danny, who had never once needed anyone to fight his battles for him. Walt had learned long ago that some men carried a kind of patience that could not be rushed, a patience built through years of waiting silently for the right moment. He trusted that patience now, even as the tension in the room climbed higher with every passing minute. If you are already picking a side in this story, drop a comment and tell us who you are rooting for, because the next few minutes change everything. By 9:30, the bar had thinned out just enough for Tyler's group to feel like they had the run of the place. Confidence, once it goes unchecked, tends to grow teeth. Tyler slid off his stool and walked toward the far end of the bar, drink in hand, moving with the loose swagger of a man who has never once considered that a room might not belong to him. He stopped beside Danny and asked, in a voice pitched for an audience, whether the seat next to him was reserved for someone special, or if old veterans just liked hogging corners. Danny answered with a short, even response, saying the seat was open if Tyler wanted it. He did not raise his voice. He did not shift in his seat. Tyler took the seat anyway, testing the space, testing the silence, the way certain men test a fence to see how hard they can lean on it before it gives. Marcus and Deacon drifted closer, sensing a show about to start, the way a crowd gathers before it even knows what it is gathering for. Tyler asked Danny what happened to his leg, phrasing it just polite enough to seem harmless, just careless enough to sting. Danny told him plainly that he had served overseas and been injured in the line of duty. He kept the details short, the way he always did, offering only the smallest window into a much larger room. Tyler nodded slowly, then made a comment about how everybody claims to be a hero these days, how anyone can buy a uniform online and tell a good story at a bar. The room quieted just slightly, a few nearby conversations pausing to listen. Walt, behind the bar, set down the glass he was drying and watched closely, ready to step in if things went further. Ray, seated with his friends, turned his head toward the sound of Tyler's voice, recognizing the mechanic from earlier that day, feeling something tighten in his chest at the disrespect in Tyler's tone. He did not know Danny well, but something in him, something built by months of training and brotherhood, refused to sit quietly while a stranger mocked a fellow veteran. Marcus chimed in, laughing, asking Danny outright what unit he served with, what rank he held, daring him to prove himself the way men do when they assume silence means someone has nothing to prove. Danny answered honestly, giving branch and years, keeping his call sign folded away where it always stayed. The bar around them had grown a little quieter, a few nearby patrons pretending to check their phones while listening closely to every word. Small towns work that way. A single conversation, once it draws enough attention, can spread through a room faster than any announcement. Ray glanced around, noticing the shift, feeling his own frustration rise on Danny's behalf even though the mechanic himself showed no sign of anger at all. Tyler scoffed, saying vague answers usually mean made-up stories, that real veterans love bragging about their achievements, not hiding behind short sentences and quiet corners. Something shifted in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Ray stood from his stool, drawn by a pull he did not fully control, and walked toward the far end of the bar. He introduced himself again to Danny, louder this time on purpose, letting Tyler's group hear every word. He told them plainly that this man had spent the afternoon fixing his motorcycle and had earned nothing but respect from him. Tyler laughed it off, calling Ray a kid still wet behind the ears, telling him real Marines did not need a mechanic to vouch for them at a bar. Ray's jaw tightened. He asked Danny directly in front of everyone what his call sign had been. It was an innocent question born from pride and instinct, meant to shame the men mocking him by revealing something real. Danny hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly toward Walt, who gave the smallest nod, permission granted by an old brother in arms. The room had gone quiet enough now that Danny's answer would carry to every corner of the bar. He looked at Tyler, then at Ray, then finally spoke two words that would end this argument before it had a chance to become something worse. He said his call sign had been Reaper 1. And then the room changed. The room did not explode into noise. It went the opposite direction. Silence dropped over the bar like a heavy curtain, thick and sudden, the kind of silence that only happens when people sense they have crossed into something much bigger than themselves. Somewhere near the pool table, a man in his 60s, wearing an old service cap, turned fully around in his chair, eyes wide, his drink forgotten in his hand. Two other patrons, both veterans by the look of their weathered forearms and quiet posture, exchanged a glance that said more than words ever could. Tyler blinked, confused by the sudden shift in the room, unaware of what those two words meant to anyone who had spent real time near a battlefield. Ray, however, went pale. He had heard stories in training, whispered legends passed between instructors who had served long enough to know real history from myth. Reaper 1 was not a name. It was a legend carried quietly through certain corners of the Marine Corps, tied to one of the most dangerous reconnaissance sniper units to ever operate in hostile territory. A team credited with saving entire columns of soldiers from ambushes nobody else saw coming. Walt set his towel down slowly, staring at Danny with an expression somewhere between shock and quiet pride. He had known this man for 3 years, had poured his drinks, had nodded at him each night, and never once knew he was serving the same quiet corner to a man whose name had once made entire enemy units retreat rather than risk contact. Walt's own service had crossed paths, distantly with stories about Reaper 1, stories told in hushed voices by men who respected fear enough to whisper it. Danny did not move from his stool. He did not puff out his chest or raise his voice to match the sudden tension crackling through the room. That had never been his way. Men who lived through what he lived through rarely needed volume to prove anything. Instead, he simply looked at Tyler, steady and calm, the same way he must have once looked through a scope at targets most people would never survive facing. His silence carried more weight than any shout could have managed. Ray found his voice first, asking quietly if it was true, if Danny had really led the reconnaissance team responsible for the extraction at a mountain pass that instructors still taught as a case study in advanced training courses. Danny gave a small nod, offering no embellishment, no dramatic retelling. He simply confirmed it the way a man confirms a fact he has made peace with long ago. Ray's chest tightened with something between awe and shame. Awe for the man beside him, shame for ever doubting that quiet corner held nothing worth respecting. He thought back to his first weeks of training, to an instructor who once described a sniper team so precise and so quiet that entire enemy patrols would turn back rather than risk walking into their range. The instructor never gave a name, only a legend spoken carefully like something sacred. Ray had assumed it was exaggeration, the kind of story instructors tell to inspire young recruits. Sitting here now, watching Danny's calm face under the dim bar lights, he understood it had never been exaggeration at all. The old veteran near the pool table, the one who had stood and placed a hand on Danny's shoulder, introduced himself quietly as a former corpsman who had served 2 decades earlier in a different conflict, in a different desert, under a different flag of command. Even so, he said the name Reaper 1 had reached him too, passed along through years of overlapping service. The way certain names travel far beyond the units that first carried them. He told Danny, in a low and steady voice, that meeting him tonight felt like meeting a piece of living history most people would never get the chance to shake hands with. Tyler tried to recover his composure, forcing a short laugh, saying names did not prove anything, that anyone could claim a title in a bar full of strangers. But his voice had lost its earlier confidence, cracking slightly at the edges. Marcus and Deacon shifted uncomfortably behind him, sensing the room had turned against their leader in a way loud words could not fix. The old veteran near the pool table stood from his chair, walked over without a word, and placed a firm hand on Danny's shoulder, a silent gesture of brotherhood that needed no explanation. Danny finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm, explaining without anger that the leg he lost was not something he liked being mocked over. He told Tyler that mockery from someone who had never served, aimed at people who had given real pieces of themselves, cut deeper than Tyler could understand. He did not raise his fist. He did not need to. His words landed with the precision of a man who had spent years learning exactly how much force a moment required, and using no more than that. The bar had fully turned now. Whispers spread from booth to booth, the name Reaper 1 passing between strangers like a current running through water. A woman near the jukebox pulled out her phone not to record a fight but to look up the name, curious about the legend suddenly sitting in human form at the end of the bar. Walt poured Danny a fresh drink on the house, refusing payment, a gesture that told the whole room exactly where his respect had settled. Danny rolled up his sleeve slightly, not for show but because the room had grown warm, and for the first time that night a faded tattoo became visible along his forearm, a simple black skull wearing a worn helmet stitched with the smallest hint of a scythe curling beneath it. It was not flashy. It was not meant to impress anyone. But in that room, among people who now understood exactly what it represented, it caught the light like a quiet confirmation of everything already spoken aloud. Tyler, cornered by silence louder than any shouting match, muttered something about needing air and turned toward the door. Marcus and Deacon hesitated, caught between loyalty to their friend and the creeping realization that they had spent the night mocking a man far braver than themselves. Ray stepped forward one last time, not to gloat, but to shake Danny's hand, thanking him not just for his service, but for the quiet dignity he had carried through every insult without breaking. Danny accepted the handshake with the same calm he had shown all night. A man who had already survived far worse than a room full of strangers finally understanding who he was. If this moment gave you chills, hit that subscribe button, because the story of what happens after this night is just as powerful. The rest of the night moved slower, quieter, the way a room settles after a storm passes through it. Tyler left without finishing his drink, his loud confidence deflated into something smaller and more human. Marcus and Deacon lingered near the door for a moment, unsure whether to follow him or stay behind and offer some kind of apology neither of them had the words for. In the end, they slipped out quietly, leaving behind a bar that no longer had any interest in their presence. Ray sat down beside Danny for the rest of the evening, asking careful questions, now respectful ones, The kind a young Marine asks an old one when he finally understands the weight behind a quiet stranger's eyes. Danny told him small pieces, not the full weight of every mission, but enough to paint a picture of sacrifice without turning it into a performance. He talked about the men he had lost, the ones in that photograph tucked behind the bolts on his workbench, the friends whose names he still said quietly to himself on hard nights. Walt refused to let Danny pay for another drink the rest of the night, and word spread quickly enough that other patrons began sending drinks down the bar without a word, small gestures of respect from strangers who suddenly understood who had been sitting among them all along. Danny accepted each one graciously, though he made it clear he did not need the attention, only the quiet knowledge that people finally saw him clearly. That was enough. 2 days later, Ray returned to the garage to pick up his motorcycle, now running clean and strong, the black smoke gone, the engine humming the way it should. He thanked Danny again, this time with none of the earlier nervous energy, replaced instead by a steady kind of respect built through shared understanding. Danny told him quietly that being a Marine did not end at discharge, that carrying respect for others, especially quiet strangers, was its own duty. Ray promised to remember it. Before Ray left the garage that day, he asked one more question, the kind he had been holding back since the bar. He wanted to know how a man who had once led the most feared reconnaissance team in his generation ended up fixing motorcycles in a small town nobody had heard of. Danny thought about it for a moment before answering. He said that after everything he had seen, after everything he had lost, he wanted a life built around fixing things instead of breaking them. He said there was a kind of peace in taking a broken engine and making it whole again, a peace that felt earned rather than given. Ray nodded slowly, understanding settling over him the way it does when a person finally sees the full shape of someone they once misjudged. That peace did not come easily. Danny still had nights when sleep would not come, when old sounds crept back into the dark corners of his mind, sounds no engine or wrench could quiet. He kept a small routine for those nights, a walk around the block, a cup of tea, sometimes a phone call to the one surviving member of his old team, a man who now lived 2 states away and understood the weight without needing a single word of explanation. Healing, Danny had learned, was not a single moment. It was 1,000 small choices made quietly, night after night, long after the applause of any bar had faded into memory. Word about that Friday night spread through town slowly, the way real stories do, without exaggeration, without needing embellishment. People who once ignored the quiet mechanic on the edge of town began stopping by his shop just to shake his hand, some bringing their own motorcycles for repair, others simply wanting to thank him for his service in person. Danny accepted the attention with the same calm he brought to everything else, never chasing it, never needing it, simply letting it exist around him the way weather exists around a mountain. A local school teacher heard the story from a parent and asked Danny if he would be willing to speak to a class of high school students about service and sacrifice. Danny hesitated at first, uncomfortable with the idea of standing in front of a room and talking about himself. But he agreed, thinking of the young faces who might one day wear a uniform of their own, who deserved honesty more than they deserved a polished speech. He kept his talk short and simple, telling the students that courage was rarely loud, that most of the bravest people they would ever meet would never announce it themselves. He told them to look for the quiet ones, the ones who showed up every day and did the work without asking for credit. Somewhere in the back row, a shy student who rarely spoke in class wrote those words down and kept them folded in a notebook for years afterward. If a lesson like that ever stuck with you, subscribe and share this one with someone who needs to hear it, because stories like Danny's deserve to travel further than one small town. The garage stayed busy through the following months, more customers than Danny had ever had before, though he never let the extra business change the way he worked. He still moved slow and careful over every engine, still refused to rush a job just because a line had formed outside his door. People began to understand that his quiet nature was not something separate from his skill, but a part of it, the same discipline that had once kept a sniper team alive now keeping every motorcycle he touched running clean and true. Tyler never returned to the anchor post. Word reached Danny eventually that the car dealership manager had grown quieter at work, less inclined to mock the veterans who came in looking for a fair deal on a used truck. Whether that change came from embarrassment or genuine reflection, nobody could say for certain. But something about that night seemed to follow him, a lesson learned the hard way, in front of a room full of witnesses who would not soon forget it. Marcus and Deacon drifted apart from Tyler in the weeks that followed, the loyalty that once bound them together thinning without the loud confidence that had first drawn them in. Marcus, in particular, found himself thinking back on that night more than he expected to, replaying the moment he had laughed at a disabled veteran's cane, feeling a discomfort he could not quite shake. He never apologized in person. Some men never do. But he stopped mocking strangers at bars, and in his own quiet way, that was its own kind of change. Like and share if you believe every town has a quiet hero nobody has noticed yet, because somewhere near you, there probably is one. Danny kept living the same quiet life he always had, waking before sunrise, fixing engines with steady hands, sitting at his usual corner of the bar where Walt now reserved his seat without being asked. He did not need medals on display or stories told loudly to strangers. His strength had never come from volume. It came from the qui. At weight he carried every single day, a weight most people would never fully understand, but one that on one Friday night the whole room finally respected. The photograph on his workbench stayed exactly where it was, tucked behind the bolts, seen only by those who knew to look. Some nights Danny still took it out and looked at the four faces beside his own, remembering names the world had mostly forgotten. He carried them with him the same way he carried everything else, quietly, steadily, without complaint. And somewhere in that quiet, in that steady weight, was a kind of strength louder than anything Tyler Briggs could have ever understood. Comment below if a quiet moment ever changed the way you saw someone, because stories like this remind us why we keep telling them. Months passed and the town settled back into its usual rhythm, though something had shifted in the way people looked at Danny Cole. He remained the same man he had always been, unassuming, steady, content with small routines and quiet mornings. But now, when customers dropped off their motorcycles, they lingered a little longer, asked a little more, listened a little closer when he spoke. Respect, once earned honestly, tends to follow a man quietly for the rest of his life, without him ever needing to ask for it. Ray Fenton returned to his unit a changed man, carrying with him a story he would tell for years, about a quiet mechanic who had once been the most feared name on a battlefield most people would never fully understand. He carried Danny's advice with him too, the reminder that respect is not something a rank or a title grants automatically. It is something built through actions, through steady hands, through the kind of dignity that survives even when nobody else is watching. On quiet evenings, Danny still sat in his corner of the anchor post, his cane resting against the bar, his eyes taking in the room the way they always had. He never needed the noise, never needed the attention, never needed anyone to know his name unless the moment truly called for it. But every so often, a stranger would sit down beside him, curious and respectful, and ask softly about the man they had heard stories about. Danny would answer the same way he always had, calm, quiet, and honest, letting the truth speak for itself, one steady word at a time.